Hello, everyone. Today's resilience expert is David Feldman. He's one of the top experts on hope in the field of psychology. As an associate professor of counseling psychology at St. Clara University, he has written for Psychology Today as well as Huffington Post, and he published numerous researches in top scientific journals. Besides that, he lectured around the world. He's joining us today from San Francisco Bay Area. Let's hear what he has to say. Hello, Dave. How are you?
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing great. How are you?
Now, I have a numerous number of questions for you. And you've wrote this wonderful book together with your co-author, Lee Daniel Kravitz. Is that right? Is that how you pronounce his name? And you talk in this book about many stories and about many people who you call super survivors. Would you mind quickly sharing with me what makes for you a super survivor?
Sure. So everyone is familiar, I think, with, at this point, thank heavens, with the phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? PTSD, which is a psychological condition that has nightmares and flashbacks and mood symptoms that can be really debilitating and awful for people who have encountered trauma. And I mean, it's a really serious disorder that deserves very serious treatment, particularly when there are so many, war zones in the world right now. We have soldiers who are returning from these that have PTSD. But I think what people are not so familiar with is the rather incredible fact that only about 17%, 17% of people who have had a serious trauma end up with PTSD. Mm-hmm. Now, again, for that 17%, it's very serious business. But that's an incredible fact about human resilience, that the vast majority of people who encounter a trauma, and by the way, that's going to be the vast majority of us during our lives. Most of us are going to encounter some kind of a trauma. The vast majority of people find a way of bouncing back. And in fact, quite a lot of us find a way of bouncing forward. So another statistic is that between 60 and 80% of people grow in some way as a result of trauma, setbacks, losses, obstacles, problems in their life. Between 50 and 80% of people grow. And that can be anything from sort of minor but important growth, like seeing the grass as greener and the sky as bluer, appreciating each moment more, deepening in our relationships with people or our spirituality if we believe in God or religion. But it can also be really dramatic growth. Things like moving to a different part of the world, changing your job, discovering a new mission or a new purpose for your life. And it's that more dramatic growth that we call super survival. And in our book, Super Survivors, we interviewed, we did over 100 interviews, but we really feature 17 people who are super survivors, who have done things like found NGOs to help people who have suffered from genocide, people who are world record holders, people who have won Nobel Prizes, and have done this partially as a result of having encountered their own trauma. And we asked the question, how did they do that?
Okay. And what were the findings?
Well, there were a lot of findings. I mean, basically, we interviewed these people and we did a deep dive into the scientific research on this. So I'm a psychology professor. And so I read hundreds of studies. And we basically identified 8 principles that are each one is a chapter that it turns out help people to grow in the face of trauma. And we can certainly go into some of them because most of them are very simple. Mm-hmm. They're things that we're already all familiar with, but maybe we don't all do very much in our lives.
Right.
And so I think part of what the book is really trying to do is say, look, here's a little bit of a roadmap about the kinds of, about how to live, about the kinds of things that we can do to set the conditions where when and if we encounter a trauma in our lives, and of course we'll all encounter lots of problems, minor and major, in our lives, how do we bounce forward? How can we be maximally resilient? Which is something we all want for ourselves and the people we love.
Absolutely. So would you say then that the core purpose of the book was to prepare everyday people for something if something tragically happens? I'm really curious here at the moment. Who is really buying your book? Is it the people who already have experienced traumas and then grab this book because they really want to know the answer? Am I falling into this category or into that one, and or getting justification from it? Or is it people who are like, just intrigued also by the, what do you call this, the trophy in the front, and to see, okay, how does success play a role here in the world where failure also happens on a daily basis?
I think it's both, and thank heavens I think it's both, because I think those are two audiences that we really wanted to address. So one of the amazing, I have to say, I think it's my favorite thing about having written this book is that when my co-author and I do book signing events or speeches, that we have people come up to us afterwards. And of course, we have people write us emails as well. And it's both of those groups of people. Often it's people who have encountered a trauma. I remember one woman came up to me. She was holding the book in her hands, and she had those little sticky notes in about 20 different pages. And she said, I have suffered a trauma. And she told us what the trauma is. And she said, reading this book gave me hope that there is a future for me, that there are things that I can do to get back to my life. And not only that, but this isn't necessarily a death sentence, my trauma, that I really can move forward in a way that's meaningful and that's successful. And that was really cool. We also have lots and lots of people, I think it's probably the majority of people, have never had a trauma. And they're reading this book because they're interested in what is super survival and how do I do that? And I actually think the principles in this book, you don't have to have had a trauma to use them. I think the central question was, for us, when we were writing it, is what can we learn from these people who have suffered extraordinary traumas and somehow done incredibly positive things in the world and are incredibly successful? What can we, all of us, even those who haven't encountered a trauma, learn about how to live successfully and happily and meaningfully? And those were really the result of our principles, which I'm happy to talk about. Yeah,
I like that. I really do like that a lot. Now, one of my favorite mottos in life is energy flows where attention goes. So obviously you've been focusing a lot on finding these stories, finding these people. What has come up for you personally? I mean, what has changed since you've published the book? And do the stories keep coming or like...
The stories do keep coming. And it's, as I said, people come up to us all the time and say, I have a story for you. And they're incredibly inspiring. What has come up for me, or what has changed for me? This book really changed me. I think it gave me a lot of hope that resilience is real. It's real for all of us. There's so many negative messages in the media. I mean, we see obviously terrorist attacks all the time. There was just a terrible bombing in Turkey yesterday. And it's so easy to become cynical about human nature when there are, in fact, so many examples of the opposite out there that are just incredible. I'll just give you one. There's a woman named Clementine Wanmaria who, of all the super survivors in the book, is the one who really most inspires me. Okay. She was 6 years old when this story started, and she and her sister, Claire, were living with their parents and grandparents in Rwanda, in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. And this was 25, 26 years ago. And a lot of your viewers will remember that that's when the terrible genocide started to happen in Rwanda. And she remembers the night that the genocide happened. Her grandparents were extremely scared, and she and her sister Claire climbed out the rear window of their grandparents' house, and they heard a group of men singing songs while they were killing people coming down the road. And she was so scared, and she and her sister Claire escaped into a grove of trees, essentially into a forest that was in back of their grandparents' house, and slowly made their way, just the two girls alone, away from their house. And when they looked back, they saw that their house was burning. And so that was the day that they believed that they had lost everyone in their family. During the next 6 or 7 years, Claire and Clementine, these 6 and 7-year-old girls clinging to each other as their only support, bounced from refugee camp to refugee camp to refugee camp. And, thank heavens that the UN sets up these refugee camps, but they're pretty awful places to be in. I mean, places filled with disease and people stealing your stuff, and there's rape, and there's murder, and there's starvation. They're pretty awful. And the things that Clementine told us she saw are just blood curdling. I mean, awful. She still says she wakes up with the nightmares sometimes. But I want to, eventually she made her way to the United States. She was sponsored to come here by a host family, and so did her sister, and she ended up in Chicago. But I want to fast forward 20, 25 years to the present. She is now a graduate of Yale University. She was tapped by President Obama to be on the Holocaust Memorial Council of the United States and serve on the Holocaust Memorial Museum's board of directors. Yeah. She speaks for the UN routinely about the dangers of genocide. Mm-hmm. She is actually founding an NGO now, I believe, to help survivors of genocide and their families. Just an amazing story of going from, everything being lost in her life, yeah, to not only successful, but really doing meaningful things for the world. And we asked her, how did you do that? And she gave us many answers to that. There are some of the principles in our book. She did it through social support, through opening herself up to the love of other people. She did it through believing in herself, and there are various ways that we know that super survivors believe in herself. And she did it through one of the major principles in our book, which is called grounded hope. And her story also has a lot of forgiveness in it. Yeah. And I can go into some of those things if you want. But for me, the central message was, wow, if someone, and I'm in awe of her, and she is this beautiful, intelligent 30-year-old woman now, or pushing 30 years old, and so intelligent and so kind. You would never have any idea that this happened to her. And yet this is part of her experience. And if she can somehow survive genocide and move forward in her life, I think there is a lot of hope for all of us who survive things like that and things much less than that we can do the same in our lives. Not everyone has to be a super survivor. There's nothing magical about founding an NGO or speaking for the UN. But I think we all can be super survivors in our own way. By being resilient.
Yes, I totally subscribe to this message, and that's why we are doing this conversation today.
Thank you.
Because it's also something I feel very strongly about, that we still educate much more in this area, that we have better researches done on that, that really everybody understands the concept of it. I've personally had to bounce back from true traumas, and the first time I did not know about post-traumatic growth. And shortly before the second trauma, I actually learned about it because of my coaching career or coaching area that I went into, and it made a profound difference in my life. Just by simply knowing the fact it doesn't have to go down spiral all the way. Right. And even if you do hit rock bottom, there is a way to get out of it again. And
I think that's such an important message, because I think one of the inadvertent messages that and I'll take credit for this. I mean, I'm part of the mental health community. I'm a psychologist. One of the things that we've done, I think, very well over the years is to take some of the stigma away from having mental health difficulties, being depressed, or having PTSD or anxiety. And I think that's a really, really good thing that we've done that. But I think we haven't done an equally good job as a field at saying that there's also a flip side to mental health difficulties, to mental disorders, and that people who often do experience PTSD or great anxiety or depression, they don't have to be stuck there. That not only can they, through the right tools and techniques, help themselves to come back to sort of baseline, but there's also a possibility for all of us to really access our assets, our strengths, and really be great. And by great, I don't mean some external standard of having a lot of money or being really successful. I mean great in using your own definition, feeling good and feeling that you have something meaningful in your life and feeling like there's a purpose moving forward. That's one of the things that came across from a lot of these super survivors, is that sense of purpose in their life, that real sense of purpose in their life. I'll give you another example of somebody who has that real sense of purpose. There was a guy named Paul Watkins, and Paul, his trauma was really bereavement. It was losing a friend who was very, very close to him. Now, he started out this story having everybody's sort of like stereotypical dream of what a successful life would look like. Mm-hmm. He was a multi-millionaire. He was in charge of a food company in New Orleans, in the U.S. here, and he made jambalaya, right? A typical spicy, wonderful rice dish. Okay. And he sold these dried jambalaya packets and made millions and built this company into a huge national and maybe even international success. And he was the CEO. But he always felt that his life was lacking something. He wasn't sure what, but he just always felt like it was lacking something. But he was happy. He was happy. Yeah. And then really the unthinkable happened. It happened on 9/11. 2001, when the whole world collectively encountered a trauma, as we have at various other times. And, big airplanes flew into big buildings and flew into the Pentagon here in the United States, killed thousands of people, destroyed people's lives. It was awful. We all witnessed this via the television and via the news media. But for him, it was much more personal. For Paul, he realized that his best friend, and in some ways a life companion for him, his best friend was the co-pilot of the airplane that hit the Pentagon.
Oh my.
And this really, threw him for a loop. Not only was he bereaved and just devastated, he was the person who actually picked up the ashes of his friend's body and brought them to his friend's parents. I mean, this was incredibly difficult for him. But it also caused him to step back and ask himself the question, like, is this who I want to be? Given that life is so short and can end so quickly, he was really confronted with his own mortality because of his loss of his friend. And his answer to the question, is this who I really want to be, was no. And so he decided to change his life. So over the course of the next year, he gave away all of his possessions, all of his fancy business suits. He gave away all of his money. He sold his multi-million-dollar company to his investors for very little money. And he became a Catholic priest. Okay. And not only did he become a priest, which was his definition of success, right? His sense of calling. But he was one of the first people, as many Catholic priests were, to return to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina a number of years ago destroyed the city. And he was instrumental in rebuilding that city. And he says that now, for the first time in his life, he feels truly, truly successful. And that's really because of encountering that purpose. And one of the things that we heard over and over and over again from our super survivors is something about encountering a trauma or a loss confronts us with our own mortality. It shows us that life is short. It confronts us with our own death. And that forces us to ask the question, is this who I want to be? Do you have time for me to tell you about an interesting study that psychologists did? I can do it quickly.
Please don't mind sharing. It's good.
Okay, I won't bore you with a lot of details, but there was a guy whose last name is Cozzolino who did a study, I think he's at the University of Minnesota, where he took normal college students. They're not known for being terribly deep, these college students. And he had them write essays. He put them in a room with a piece of paper, and he said, for the next 20 minutes, I'd like you to write about your own death, which is something that not many of us think about. We try not to think about it. It seems so scary. And he said, I want you to write about your own death and, when you will die and how old you want to be and where you will be buried and all of that. Mm-hmm. But don't stop there. I also want you to write about your life up to that point and the legacy that you want to leave and what you want people to say about you after you die. And I want you to do that for 20 minutes. And what he found was that people who did this for 20 minutes ended up being less selfish, less greedy, more spiritual, more altruistic. 20 minutes of this writing exercise. So that's one of the things.
Exercise, yes.
That's one of the things we suggest doing in our book. I mean, I've done it. It's uncomfortable, but I think that is essentially one of the things that helps make super survivors, and it's something we all can do in 20 minutes, whether or not we've encountered a trauma.
Absolutely. I know of a similar writing exercise which just works in the opposite direction. You start off by thinking, what would you do if you had 6 seconds to live? And 6 seconds is such a very short time frame. We are in this conversation. I might use the time to say goodbye to you and thank you for this interview. I don't know.
It's been my pleasure.
Then you extend the time frame and you go to 6 minutes and then you go to 6 hours. By that you follow with 6 days and 6 weeks, and then I think you go all the way to 6 years or something. And then you all of a sudden realize, okay, there is definitely an expiry date, which we don't know when it will come, and we don't know in what circumstances we are in at that point in time. But we do realize we have all these seconds up to this point, which we decide completely autonomously how we want to treat the people around us, how we want to spend the time, with who we want to spend our time, and how we want to leave this place in the end of the day. And so I do fully understand the power of looking at your mortality and the impact it can have on individuals.
And that each day has incredible potential.
Yes.
And I think that message of hope and of purpose and that the future can be brighter than the present, even if the present is pretty bright, but even if it's not, is one of the central message that the super survivors that we interviewed want to communicate, and that we hope to communicate in this book. And it's certainly also the scientific research in the field of psychology and sociology definitely support as well.
Now, David, what do you do when you have a bad day?
Actually, what do I do when I have a bad day? I do a lot of the things that we recommend also in this book. So one of the major things I do is that I open myself up to the support of others. It's not something we've talked about in this interview so far, but we know in the research, and I certainly know that we all have a gut feeling that, our friends, our family, the people that we care about, relying on their support is definitely one of the best predictors of recovery and resilience after trauma. And I have to say, I think that's a hard thing to do, because when I think we've encountered a trauma or we've had a really bad day, sometimes we just want to isolate ourselves, and just want to sit in a room alone and stew. And oftentimes I think people with trauma sort of think to themselves, well, no one could ever understand what I've gone through. And that may very, very well be the case. Everyone has a really unique experience of trauma and loss and problems in their life. But I think it is precisely those times when we've had those terrible days or terrible weeks or terrible years that we know that it's so important not to close down, but to open up and to go to people, even if it's just to go to someone and say, will you go to a movie with me? Will you distract me? Will you listen to some music with me? Or will you talk about the book that we read in common? Or if it's deeper conversation, will you listen to my pain and help to support me and give me a hug? Will you remember the person that we both lost together and grieve with me? All of those types of social support are so important. And so what do I do when I have a bad day? Honestly, what I do is to appeal to the people that I love. And they can often remind me that of a lot of the other principles in our book, that there is hope.
Yeah.
They can sometimes help me to forgive myself or forgive others. They can help me to do the next step. And so I always think that's so important to do. And for those people listening out there, if you think, well, I don't have a friend, see if you can find a support group. I always say, call your local church, call your local mental health clinic. There are so many, at least where I live here in Northern California, there are so many very inexpensive and even free opportunities to find support. There's always someone out there to support you. And often that can start you on your journey towards resilience and indeed maybe even towards super survival.
Yeah. And I kind of challenge people in organizations very often when they have a good day or a normal day or just an average day, that they make it a habit to reaching out to others, because when you activate that muscle of, you are used to going to your social connections, then it's also much easier when difficult times arise. So I often use then the exercise with them that we say, okay, call somebody whose birthday is in 6 months from now. Don't call somebody whose birthday is today, because he's going to get anyway 100 calls. But call somebody in 6 months, whose birthday is in 6 months from now. And that helps if you practice this as well. Yeah. So it makes it easier to reach out then.
I think it's never too soon to really start living fully. It's never too soon to start living like you're dying. Going back to our conversation about 6 minutes and 6 days and 6 hours, 6 years, whatever. I think it's never too soon to start to flex these muscles. Another one that, is a big one is forgiveness. We harbor so much unforgiveness towards others often. People tend to hold grudges sometimes and harbor so much anger, so much frustration and resentment. But we also often blame ourselves and attack ourselves and are so unforgiving of ourselves. And we know that forgiveness of others and self, as hard as that is to do, because some things are very hard to forgive, is so important in resilience, that forgiveness really is a gift that we give to ourselves, not to a perpetrator. It's giving ourselves permission to move forward, whether or not we ever talk to the perpetrator again, whether or not the perpetrator ever apologizes. It's finding a way to release ourselves from the burden of how we've been wronged and move forward. And so if we can give ourselves that gift, that's so important too. And that's a muscle that you can learn to flex early in life, to be less unforgiving.
I solved a personal problem in my life with that forgiveness. I was holding a grudge against a previous landlord, and I was very upset with that person, and I started meditating around it, and I was trying to see that person with a lot of light around them, with a lot of love, and really trying to feel that within. And it's funny, the problem was resolved without arguments, without backwards and forwards and battering, because I was able to shift something within myself, and that itself had an impact on the energy around it. So, yeah.
Well, going back to Clementine's story, the little girl now approaching 30 who survived genocide and has gone on to
the big things.
we asked her how she did it, and one of the major principles she brought up was forgiveness. And she said that it was through forgiveness that she was able to move forward and found an NGO and work with the UN and all of that stuff. And we just said, oh my gosh, how is it possible that you were able to forgive genocide? And she said, look, I have a particular definition of forgiveness that may be different than most people's. And we asked her what it was. And she said, first of all, forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's not about forgetting the past. It's also not about saying that what happened was right. In fact, she spent her life arguing against genocide and trying to build support for organizations that help genocide survivors. Okay. She said also, it's not about saying to the perpetrator, you're okay, everything's fine. It's her perpetrator. She doesn't even know who the people that killed members of her family were. She said that what forgiveness was for her, she had a particular definition of it. She said that it was letting go of the hope that the past could be any different. Letting go of the hope that the past could be different. She said she had to admit to herself that she doesn't have a time machine, that she can't go back into the past and change things. All she's capable of changing is the future. And so she said it was about breaking those chains that bind her to her very painful past, and instead asking herself, what now? How am I going to use my experiences to build the best life I can now? And that really was what she meant by forgiveness. And I think that that's something that's hard to do. And I think it's something that we all can take baby steps towards starting to do in our lives right now, even for much smaller things, of course, than what she went through.
David, I have at this point in time really nothing to add. It was an amazing and really eye-opening conversation that I had with you. I want to say thank you for giving me the time and having this interview with me. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.